My daughter-in-law faked a pregnancy for 9 months to steal our family fortune, complete with fake ultrasounds, staged doctor visits, and a planned miscarriage to access our trust funds. What I discovered when I followed her to what I thought was a prenatal appointment will shock you to your core. Before we dive into this incredible story, please hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from today. My name is Margaret, and at 73 years old, I thought I'd seen everything life could throw at me. I'd raised 3 children, buried my beloved husband Robert 2 years ago, and managed to keep our family's construction business thriving even in my golden years. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the elaborate deception my daughter-in-law Stephanie would orchestrate to steal the fortune Robert and I had spent 45 years building together. It all started innocently enough on a crisp October morning when my son David called with news that should have filled my heart with joy. "Mom, you might want to sit down for this," he said, and I could hear the excitement bubbling in his voice even through the phone. "Stephanie's pregnant. You're going to be a grandmother again." I nearly dropped my coffee mug right there in my kitchen. David and Stephanie had been married for 3 years, and while I'd always hoped for grandchildren, Stephanie had been vocal about focusing on her career first. She worked as a marketing coordinator for a small firm downtown, and David was following in his father's footsteps in our construction business. At 32 and 29 respectively, they seemed to have plenty of time, but I'd secretly been hoping they'd start thinking about babies soon. "Oh, David, that's wonderful news," I managed to say, though something in his voice made me pause. There was an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite identify, not unhappiness exactly, but maybe uncertainty. "How far along is she?" "About 8 weeks, he replied. "She just found out yesterday. We wanted you to be the first to know." The next few months should have been filled with the joy and anticipation that comes with expecting a new family member, and at first they were. Stephanie seemed to glow with that special radiance pregnant women are supposed to have. She started wearing looser clothing, began talking about nursery decorations, and even asked me to help her pick out maternity clothes. I was over the moon. This would be my first grandchild, and I threw myself into the role of doting grandmother-to-be with enthusiasm. I started knitting tiny sweaters and blankets, researching the best cribs and strollers, and even began converting Robert's old study into a nursery for when they'd visit with the baby. But as the weeks turned into months, I began to notice things that didn't quite add up. Small things at first, the kind of details that nag at the back of your mind but don't seem important enough to voice. Stephanie never seemed to have morning sickness, which I found odd since I'd been violently ill with all 3 of my pregnancies. She also never seemed to show the typical signs of pregnancy fatigue that I remembered so well. When I mentioned this to David, he just shrugged it off. "Everyone's pregnancy is different, Mom. Stephanie's just lucky, I guess." But even he seemed less excited than I would have expected from a first-time father. When I'd ask about doctor's appointments or ultrasounds, he'd give vague answers or change the subject entirely. The first real red flag came during what should have been Stephanie's 4th month. I'd invited them both over for Sunday dinner, something we'd been doing every week since Robert passed away. It was our way of staying connected as a family, and I looked forward to these meals more than anything else in my week. Stephanie arrived wearing a fitted dress that should have shown at least some sign of her growing belly, but she looked exactly the same as she had 3 months earlier. When I commented on how well she was carrying the pregnancy, she just smiled and said something about having a strong core from all her yoga practice. But it was what happened during dinner that really set off alarm bells in my head. David had made a comment about needing to start thinking about converting their spare bedroom into a nursery, and Stephanie's reaction was strange. Instead of the excitement I'd expect from an expectant mother discussing her baby's room, she looked almost panicked for just a split second before covering it with a bright smile. "Oh, there's plenty of time for that," she said quickly. "I don't want to jinx anything by getting too prepared too early." I understood being cautious, especially in the first trimester, but she was supposedly well into her 2nd trimester by then. Most expectant mothers I knew were eagerly planning nurseries and buying baby clothes by that point. Stephanie's reluctance struck me as odd, but I chalked it up to her naturally cautious personality and didn't think much more about it at the time. The second red flag came a few weeks later when I offered to accompany Stephanie to one of her prenatal appointments. I'd been hoping to hear the baby's heartbeat and maybe see an ultrasound image. My own mother had never had the chance to be involved in my pregnancies since she lived across the country, and I was excited about the opportunity to be a hands-on grandmother from the very beginning. "Oh, that's so sweet of you to offer," Stephanie said, but her smile seemed forced. But these appointments are so boring, just routine checkups. There's really no need for you to waste your time sitting in a waiting room. When I persisted, suggesting that I wouldn't mind the wait and would love to be involved, she became more insistent. Really, Margaret, I appreciate the thought, but I prefer to keep my medical appointments private. David doesn't even come to most of them. That struck me as particularly odd. Robert had come to every single one of my prenatal appointments, even taking time off work to be there. He said he wouldn't miss a chance to check on his babies and his wife. When I mentioned this to David later, he seemed uncomfortable. Stephanie's pretty independent about that stuff, Mom. She says there's no point in both of us missing work for routine appointments. But something in his voice told me he wasn't entirely comfortable with the arrangement either. I began to wonder if there was trouble in their marriage that I wasn't aware of. Maybe the pregnancy had created stress between them, or maybe David was feeling left out of the process. As Stephanie's pregnancy progressed into what should have been her 6th month, I noticed that she still wasn't showing in the way I'd expect. She'd started wearing very loose, flowing tops and dresses, which she explained as being more comfortable, but even with the looser clothing, I couldn't detect the pronounced belly that should have been visible by then. When I mentioned this concern to my neighbor Helen, who'd had 4 children of her own, she agreed that it seemed unusual. Some women do carry differently, she acknowledged, but by 6 months there's usually no hiding it, no matter how you dress. That conversation planted a seed of doubt that I couldn't I started paying closer attention to Stephanie's behavior and appearance during our weekly Sunday dinners, and the more I observed, the more convinced I became that something wasn't right. It was during this time that I noticed Stephanie had developed a habit of always carrying a large purse or placing a cushion on her lap when she sat down. She'd also started excusing herself frequently to use the bathroom during our meals, sometimes staying gone for 10 or 15 minutes at a time. When she'd return, she'd often seem flustered or like she'd been rushing. The breaking point came during what should have been Stephanie's 7th month. I'd been shopping for baby clothes and had found the most adorable little outfit that I couldn't resist buying. I decided to surprise Stephanie by stopping by their house unannounced to show her my purchase. When I rang the doorbell, it took several minutes for Stephanie to answer, and when she finally did, she looked startled and out of breath. She was wearing a bathrobe even though it was mid-afternoon, and her hair was disheveled like she'd been sleeping. "Margaret, what a surprise," she said, but she didn't invite me in right away like she usually did. Instead, she stood in the doorway, blocking my view into the house. "I'm sorry to drop by unannounced, dear, but I found the cutest baby outfit and couldn't wait to show you," I explained, holding up the shopping bag. Stephanie's eyes darted nervously behind me and then back to my face. "That's so thoughtful of you, but now isn't really a good time. I was just taking a nap." But something wasn't right about her appearance. For someone who claimed to be 7 months pregnant, she looked remarkably flat under that bathrobe, and there was something about the way she was standing like she was trying to hide something. "Are you feeling all right, honey?" I asked, genuinely concerned. "You look a little pale." "Oh, just tired. You know how pregnancy can be," she said quickly. "Maybe we could look at the outfit tonight at dinner." I agreed and left, but the encounter bothered me for the rest of the day. Something about Stephanie's behavior had been off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been hiding something from me. That evening at dinner, Stephanie seemed back to her normal self, wearing one of her flowing maternity tops and chatting about baby names and nursery themes. But I found myself studying her more closely than I ever had before, and what I saw confused me even more. The woman sitting across from me at my dining room table looked exactly like someone who was 7 months pregnant should look. Her belly was round and pronounced under her maternity top. She had that characteristic pregnancy glow, and she even rubbed her stomach in the unconscious way expectant mothers do. But earlier that day, under her bathrobe, she'd appeared completely flat. The discrepancy was so stark that I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. How could someone look dramatically different from one moment to the next? Unless, the thought that crossed my mind was so outrageous that I initially dismissed it entirely. But once the idea took root, I couldn't stop thinking about it. What if Stephanie wasn't really pregnant at all? What if she was somehow faking the entire thing? But why would anyone fake a pregnancy for months? And how could she possibly fool David, her husband who lived with her every day? The whole idea seemed absurd, like something out of a soap opera rather than real life. Still, I couldn't shake my suspicions. I started paying even closer attention to Stephanie's behavior, looking for inconsistencies or signs that something wasn't right. And the more I watched, the more convinced I became that my impossible theory might actually be true. The first thing I noticed was that Stephanie's pregnant belly seemed to vary in size and shape from visit to visit. Sometimes it appeared higher, sometimes lower, sometimes more pronounced, sometimes less so. At first, I attributed this to the different clothes she wore or the way she was sitting or standing. But the variations seemed too dramatic to be explained by clothing or posture alone. I also noticed that Stephanie never seemed to experience any of the common discomforts of late pregnancy. She never complained about back pain, swollen feet, or trouble sleeping. She never had to use the bathroom more frequently, despite claiming to be in her third trimester. She never seemed to have trouble getting up from chairs or moving around, the way I remembered struggling during the final months of my pregnancies. Most tellingly, I never saw her eating with the appetite of a pregnant woman. Throughout all 3 of my pregnancies, I'd been constantly hungry, eating far more than usual to nourish my growing babies. But Stephanie's eating habits hadn't changed at all since announcing her pregnancy. If anything, she seemed to eat less during our Sunday dinners than she had before. All of these observations might have been explained away individually, but together they painted a picture that was becoming harder and harder to ignore. The problem was that my theory was so outlandish that I couldn't imagine sharing it with anyone, especially not David. How do you tell your son that you think his wife is faking a pregnancy? The breakthrough came entirely by accident. I've been having trouble sleeping, partly due to my growing suspicions about Stephanie and partly because of general anxiety about becoming a grandmother at my age. One night, unable to fall asleep, I decided to get up and do some research online about pregnancy symptoms and development. As I was reading about fetal development timelines, I came across an article about something called pseudocyesis or false pregnancy, where women experience pregnancy symptoms without actually being pregnant. But as I read more, I realized that wasn't what I suspected was happening with Stephanie. Pseudocyesis involved women who genuinely believed they were pregnant due to psychological factors. What I was beginning to suspect was much more deliberate and calculated. That led me down a rabbit hole of research about pregnancy fraud and the various ways people had attempted to fake pregnancies throughout history. What I discovered shocked me. There were entire online communities dedicated to helping people fake pregnancies, complete with detailed instructions on how to create fake belly prosthetics, forge medical documents, and even stage miscarriages. The more I read, the more plausible my theory became. And the more I thought about it, the more I began to understand what might motivate someone to attempt such an elaborate deception. Robert and I had been very successful in our construction business. Over the years, we'd accumulated significant wealth, including property, investments, and life insurance policies. When Robert died, he'd left everything to me, but our will also included provisions for our children and any future grandchildren. Specifically, the birth of our first grandchild would trigger the release of a substantial trust fund that Robert and I had established years earlier. The trust was designed to provide financial security for our grandchildren's education and future needs, but it also included provisions that would give the parents access to significant funds for child-related expenses. If Stephanie knew about the trust fund, which she very well might since David handled much of my financial planning, she would understand that a pregnancy would unlock access to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And if she was planning to stage a miscarriage after gaining access to the funds, she might believe she could get away with keeping the money even after the supposed tragedy. The realization hit me like a physical blow. If my suspicions were correct, Stephanie wasn't just lying about being pregnant. She was orchestrating an elaborate fraud designed to steal from our family. And David, my sweet, trusting son, was being manipulated just as much as I was. But I still needed proof. My suspicions, no matter how strong, wouldn't be enough to convince David or anyone else. I needed concrete evidence of Stephanie's deception, and I knew that getting it would require careful planning and a bit of detective work. I started by trying to verify the basic details of Stephanie's pregnancy. She'd mentioned several times that she was seeing Dr. Jennifer Walsh, an obstetrician with a practice downtown. I called Dr. Walsh's office, claiming to be Stephanie's mother-in-law who wanted to send flowers to the office to thank them for taking such good care of my daughter-in-law. The receptionist was very sweet but told me that they had no patient by the name of Stephanie Coleman in their system. When I double-checked the spelling and mentioned that she might be listed under her maiden name, the receptionist checked again but came up empty. "I'm sorry, but we definitely don't have anyone by that name as a patient," she said. "Are you sure you have the right office?" I thanked her and hung up, my heart pounding. If Stephanie wasn't a patient at the office she claimed to be visiting for prenatal care, where was she going during all those supposed doctor's appointments? Next, I decided to try to verify one of the ultrasound images Stephanie had shown us. She'd brought a printout to dinner a few months earlier, claiming it was from her 20-week scan. The image had been grainy and hard to make out, but David had been so excited that I hadn't wanted to dampen his enthusiasm by asking too many questions. I took a photo of the ultrasound image with my phone and did a reverse image search online. Within minutes, I found the exact same image on a website that sold fake ultrasound pictures to people who wanted to prank their friends and family. The image was labeled as a 20-week fetal ultrasound and could be purchased for $15 along with a fake medical report. The evidence was becoming overwhelming, but I knew I needed to catch Stephanie in the act to have any hope of convincing David. I decided to follow her during one of her supposed prenatal appointments to see where she was really going. The following Tuesday, Stephanie had mentioned that she had a doctor's appointment at 2 o'clock. I positioned myself in my car across the street from their house at 1:30 and waited. Sure enough, at 1:45, Stephanie emerged from the house carrying her purse and a small bag. Instead of heading toward Dr. Walsh's office downtown, Stephanie drove in the opposite direction toward the mall on the other side of town. I followed at a distance, my heart racing as I tried to process what I was seeing. Stephanie parked at the mall and went inside, and I followed her as discreetly as I could. She went straight to the maternity store in the mall's main corridor, but instead of shopping for maternity clothes, she headed directly to the fitting rooms in the back of the store. I pretended to browse the sale rack near the fitting rooms, trying to stay out of sight while keeping an eye on Stephanie's movements. After about 20 minutes, she emerged from the fitting room looking dramatically different. Her previously flat stomach now protruded in a convincing pregnancy bump under her loose top. I watched in stunned silence as Stephanie admired herself in the fitting room mirror, turning from side to side to examine her fake pregnancy profile. She then carefully adjusted the prosthetic belly under her clothes, making sure it looked natural and believable. My hands were shaking as I followed Stephanie out of the maternity store and back to her car. The evidence was undeniable now. She was using some kind of prosthetic belly to fake her pregnancy, putting it on before coming home from her supposed doctor's appointments and presumably taking it off when she was alone. But I still needed to understand the full scope of her deception. How long had she been planning this? What was her endgame? And most importantly, how was I going to break this devastating news to David? Over the next few days, I conducted more surveillance, following Stephanie during her daily routines and trying to piece together the full picture of her deception. What I discovered was even more elaborate than I'd initially imagined. Stephanie had clearly been planning this fraud for months, possibly even before she announced her pregnancy. She'd researched pregnancy symptoms and development timelines meticulously, timing her supposed milestones to coincide with what would be expected at each stage. She'd created fake medical documents, purchased ultrasound images online, and even practiced the physical behaviors associated with pregnancy. Most disturbingly, I discovered that she'd been researching miscarriage statistics and procedures, based on her internet search history, which I was able to access when she left her laptop open during one of our Sunday dinners. She was planning to stage a pregnancy loss sometime in the next few weeks. The search history revealed queries about natural miscarriage symptoms, how to fake a miscarriage, and insurance payouts for pregnancy loss. She'd also been researching grief counseling and support groups, apparently planning to use the supposed tragedy to gain sympathy and deflect suspicion. I realized that time was running out. If Stephanie was planning to stage a miscarriage soon, she would likely try to access the trust fund money before the supposed loss, claiming she needed it for medical expenses or baby preparations. Once she had the money, a fake miscarriage would allow her to keep it while playing the role of a grieving mother. The final piece of evidence came when I decided to search Stephanie's car while she was inside our house during one of our Sunday dinners. I'd noticed that she always kept her car locked and her purse with her, which had struck me as unusually cautious behavior. Using the spare key that David had given me months earlier for emergencies, I quickly searched Stephanie's car while she and David were helping me clear the dinner dishes. In the trunk, hidden under a blanket, I found a small suitcase containing multiple prosthetic pregnancy bellies in different sizes, fake medical documents with forged doctor signatures, and a collection of pregnancy test strips that appeared to have been tampered with. But the most damning evidence was a handwritten notebook detailing her entire plan. The notebook contained timelines for her fake pregnancy, notes about how much money she expected to access from the trust fund, and detailed plans for staging her miscarriage, including which hospital she would go to and what symptoms she would claim to experience. The notebook also revealed her motivation more clearly than I'd understood before. Stephanie was deeply in debt from credit card spending and a failed business venture she'd hidden from David. She owed over $60,000 to various creditors and was facing the possibility of bankruptcy and legal action. The trust fund represented a way out of her financial troubles, but she knew that actually having a baby would complicate her plans and tie her to our family permanently. A fake pregnancy followed by a staged miscarriage would give her access to the money while also providing an exit strategy if she decided to leave David later. Reading those cold, calculated plans in Stephanie's own handwriting was one of the most heartbreaking moments of my life. This woman had been manipulating my son, lying to our family, and planning to steal from us for months. And she'd been doing it all while accepting our love, support, and excitement about the grandchild that never existed. But the hardest part was knowing that I would have to destroy David's happiness and break his heart by revealing the truth. He was so excited about becoming a father, and exposing Stephanie's deception would devastate him in ways that might take years to heal. I spent several sleepless nights trying to figure out the best way to handle the situation. Part of me wanted to confront Stephanie directly and give her a chance to come clean to David herself. But I knew that approach was naive. Someone who had orchestrated such an elaborate deception wasn't going to suddenly develop a conscience. I also considered going to the police, since what Stephanie was doing was clearly fraud. But I wanted to give David a chance to process the information and decide how he wanted to handle things before involving law enforcement. In the end, I decided that David deserved to know the truth, no matter how painful it would be. I gathered all the evidence I'd collected and arranged to meet with him privately away from Stephanie to share what I'd discovered. The conversation was every bit as devastating as I'd expected it to be. David's initial reaction was complete disbelief and anger at me for even suggesting such a thing about his wife. But as I presented the evidence piece by piece, I watched his face change from anger to confusion to horror as the reality of the situation sank in. The fake ultrasound images, the non-existent doctor's appointments, the prosthetic bellies in her car, and finally the notebook detailing her entire plan, each piece of evidence hit David like a physical blow. By the time I finished laying out everything I discovered, he was sitting in stunned silence, staring at the evidence spread out on my kitchen table. "I don't understand," he finally whispered. "Why would she do this to us, to me?" I explained what I'd learned about Stephanie's financial situation and her plan to access the trust fund money before staging a miscarriage. David listened in growing horror as he realized the extent of his wife's deception and betrayal. "She never loved me," he said quietly. "This was all just a con game to her." My heart broke for my son as I watched him process the destruction of his marriage and his dreams of fatherhood. But I also felt a grim satisfaction knowing that we'd uncovered Stephanie's plan before she could complete her fraud and disappear with our family's money. David and I spent the rest of that evening planning how to confront Stephanie and what steps we needed to take to protect ourselves legally and financially. We decided to involve a lawyer and potentially law enforcement, depending on how Stephanie responded when confronted with the evidence. The confrontation took place the following Sunday during our regular family dinner. David had asked Stephanie to come early so we could have a private conversation before the meal. I had arranged for my lawyer to be present via phone, and we'd also contacted the police to let them know about the potential fraud case. When Stephanie arrived, she was wearing one of her maternity outfits and sporting what should have been an 8-month pregnancy belly. She seemed relaxed and happy, chatting about nursery preparations and joking about how ready she was for the baby to arrive. David let her talk for a few minutes before quietly placing the evidence on the dining room table in front of her. The change in Stephanie's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The color drained from her face as she recognized the prosthetic bellies, fake documents, and her own handwritten notebook. "What is this?" she asked, but her voice was weak and shaky. "I think you know exactly what it is," David replied, his voice steady but filled with pain. "The question is why, Stephanie, why did you do this to us?" For a moment, I thought Stephanie might try to deny everything or come up with some elaborate explanation. But as she looked at the evidence spread out in front of her, she seemed to realize that her deception had been thoroughly exposed. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said quietly, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "I was desperate. I owed so much money, and I thought if I could just get access to some of the trust fund money, I could pay off my debts and then figure out a way to make things right." "By faking a miscarriage?" David asked incredulously. "You were going to put us through the grief of losing a grandchild that never existed." Stephanie's tears came harder then, and for the first time since I'd begun suspecting her deception, I felt a moment of sympathy for her. She was clearly a woman who had made terrible choices out of desperation and fear, but that didn't excuse the elaborate cruelty of what she'd done to our family. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated and emotionally draining for everyone involved. Stephanie was ultimately charged with fraud, forgery, and attempted theft. The evidence we'd gathered was more than sufficient to prove her guilt, and she eventually accepted a plea deal that included restitution, probation, and community service. David filed for divorce immediately, and Stephanie moved out of their house within a week of the confrontation. The dissolution of their marriage was swift and final, with David wanting nothing more than to remove her from his life as completely as possible. The emotional aftermath was much more difficult to resolve than the legal issues. David struggled with feelings of betrayal, humiliation, and grief for the child he'd thought he was going to have. He blamed himself for not recognizing the signs of Stephanie's deception and worried that his judgment about people could never be trusted again. I tried to support him through his healing process while dealing with my own feelings of anger and violation. Stephanie had manipulated not just David, but our entire family, stealing months of joy and anticipation that we could never get back. The excitement I'd felt about becoming a grandmother had been completely fabricated, built on lies and deception. But perhaps the most difficult aspect of the entire situation was learning to trust again. If Stephanie could fool us so completely for so long, what did that say about our ability to judge people's character? How could we protect ourselves from similar deceptions in the future? It took months of family counseling and individual therapy for David and me to begin processing the trauma of Stephanie's betrayal. We learned that financial fraud by family members is more common than most people realize, and that the emotional damage from such betrayals can be just as devastating as the financial losses. We also learned that our experience, while extreme, wasn't unique. There are documented cases of people faking pregnancies for various reasons, from seeking attention to attempting insurance fraud. The availability of prosthetic bellies, fake medical documents, and other tools online has made such deceptions easier to pull off than ever before. One of the most important lessons we learned was the importance of verifying information independently, even when it comes from people we trust. If I hadn't followed my instincts and investigated Stephanie's claims, she might have succeeded in her fraud and caused even more damage to our family. We also learned about the legal protections available to families dealing with financial fraud, including ways to structure trusts and inheritances to prevent unauthorized access. Our lawyer helped us revise our estate planning documents to include additional safeguards against future attempts at fraud or manipulation. The healing process was slow and difficult, but it brought David and me closer together as we supported each other through the aftermath of Stephanie's betrayal. We learned to appreciate the genuine relationships in our lives more deeply and to be more cautious about extending trust to new people. David eventually began dating again, though he was understandably cautious about getting serious with anyone. He insisted on longer courtships and more thorough background checks before making any major commitments. While I understood his caution, I also worried that Stephanie's betrayal might prevent him from ever fully opening his heart to love again. For my part, I learned to trust my instincts more and to speak up when something doesn't feel right, even if my concerns seem unfounded or might upset someone I care about. If I'd voiced my early suspicions about Stephanie's pregnancy, we might have uncovered her deception sooner and avoided some of the emotional damage. The financial impact of Stephanie's attempted fraud was ultimately minimal, since we caught her before she could access any significant amounts from the trust fund. But the emotional cost was enormous, affecting not just David and me but our extended family and friends who had also been excited about the expected baby. Looking back on the experience now, more than 2 years later, I'm grateful that we uncovered Stephanie's deception when we did. If she had succeeded in accessing the trust fund money and staging a fake miscarriage, the emotional and financial damage could have been catastrophic for our family. I'm also grateful for the strength and resilience David showed in dealing with the situation. While the betrayal was devastating, he ultimately emerged from it as a stronger and wiser person. He learned valuable lessons about trust, judgment, and the importance of verifying important claims, even from people we love. The experience also taught us both about the importance of family support during difficult times. Having each other to lean on during the investigation, confrontation, and legal proceedings made an unbearable situation somewhat more manageable. We learned that while individuals can deceive and betray us, the strength of genuine family bonds can help us survive even the most devastating betrayals. Perhaps most importantly, the experience reminded us that while trust is precious and should be given carefully, it shouldn't be withheld entirely out of fear of being hurt again. The capacity to love and trust is what makes us human, and while that capacity can be exploited by unscrupulous people, it's also what allows us to form the meaningful relationships that make life worth living. Today, David is in a healthy relationship with a wonderful woman named Sarah who has been patient and understanding about his need to take things slowly. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Sarah gradually, and I'm cautiously optimistic that she might truly become the daughter-in-law I'd hoped Stephanie would be. As for me, I've learned to appreciate the authentic relationships in my life more deeply while maintaining appropriate boundaries with new people. I've also become involved in educating other seniors about financial fraud and the warning signs of family members who might be attempting to take advantage of them. The experience with Stephanie was undoubtedly one of the most difficult and painful periods of my life, but it also taught me valuable lessons about resilience, the importance of following instincts, and the strength that can be found in facing difficult truths. While I wouldn't wish such an experience on anyone, I'm grateful for the wisdom and strength it ultimately brought to our family. If you found this story compelling and want to hear more true stories about family drama and betrayal, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Let us know in the comments what you think about Stephanie's elaborate deception and whether you've ever experienced similar family betrayals. For more shocking family stories, click on the suggested video that should be appearing on your screen right now.